This is the only gut health guide you'll ever need. Most advice about gut health is complete BS, and this is because most people don't really understand how the gut works. Your gut is actually a very complex system, so I'm going to break it down into four key principles: your gut microbiome, digestion and motility, the gut barrier, and immune signaling. Gut microbiome. This is probably going to be the most important thing you learn in this video. Your digestive tract is home to trillions of microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, viruses, and the purpose of these microbes are to help digest, produce metabolites like short-chain fatty acids, which we'll talk about a little bit later, regulate hormones and bile, and also communicate to your immune system and brain via protein signals. Now, they looked at the microbiome of an African tribe known as the Hadza and compared them to modern people. And they noticed that they had higher biodiversity and richness in their biome. Now, why does this matter? It's because these microbes influence everything from your immune function to your mental health to even how you behave. The more research that we've done into the microbiome, the more it's starting to look like we have somewhat of a symbiotic relationship with these microbes. And when you have low microbiome diversity, it is directly linked to chronic inflammatory and metabolic illnesses like IBS, IBD, obesity, depression, type 2 diabetes, even allergies. A lot of people think allergies and food intolerances are genetics. The reason this Hadza tribe is so diverse is because from the moment they're born, they're exposed to bacteria, which strengthen their biome from an early age. Here, when children are born, they're put in these cozy blankets and fed chemically processed slop, and their biome diversity becomes extremely weak and volatile, which is why as they grow up, they begin reacting to certain foods and environments that they haven't been around. Now, optimizing your microbiome is actually very easy, contrary to what most people think, and it's because your gut is changing and transmuting every second. The first thing you need to know is if you want to optimize for a richer and more diverse biome, you need to eliminate anything that can feed pathogens. That includes alcohol, processed foods, unprescribed medication, anything that contains artificial sweeteners. The problem with consuming these things is that they directly feed pathogens and the bad bacteria in your biome, which then produce harmful metabolites like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Instead, what you want to prioritize is nutrient flexibility. The strongest predictor of microbiome richness in humans is the number of different plant foods consumed per week. They actually studied this on adults who had late-stage kidney disease. They had them eat a relatively simple diet, and then they switched them up to a high-diversity diet full of different fruits and vegetables. They noticed that their gut microbes increased production of beneficial metabolites like butyrate, which again we'll talk about a little bit later. They also increased their bowel movements, which help eliminate toxic byproducts and accumulated toxins. They also reported significantly less symptoms. You also want to be eating tons of fermented foods, polyphenols, soluble fibers, and resistant starches. These are all proven to improve biome diversity and richness. A good example of a diet like this could include soaked chia seeds for the soluble fiber and omega-3s. You've got kefir, raw milk for the lactate and live microbes. Berries, pomegranate, pure undutched cacao for the polyphenols. Carrots, broccoli, cauliflower for different fiber structures and sulfur compounds, and then you've got sweet potatoes for the resistant starches. Now, an important thing to mention is that you should be consuming animal-based products like beef, eggs, liver for its nutritional profile and amino acids, but there isn't any conclusive evidence that would suggest that eating these have any impact on your microbiome richness specifically or your diversity, but it is still crucial for your metabolism. So how do you know if your gut microbiome is in optimal condition? Well, firstly, if you have acne or any form of skin conditions, that's usually a big red flag. If your energy levels are low and you struggle with drive or libido, your biome has a direct influence on your metabolism. These are all signs that you have gut dysbiosis, which just means that you have more bad bacteria than good ones, or you have some version of leaky gut or a weak gut barrier, which again we'll talk about a little bit later. This again is a problem because this goes upstream and develops into low-grade inflammation, which then translates into metabolic dysfunction. Another very easy way to understand your microbiome health is by doing a stool analysis, or simply just by looking at your bowel movements. Like sometimes I use this app called Flush, and it gives you like a rating on your bowel health. But these are all ways you can tell if your microbiome is in an optimal state or not. Now, if you're like really advanced, you can take one of these GI tests. They are very extensive. Like they will give you a very comprehensive analysis of your gut microbiome, but like you would have to, to say the least, it's quite a pain to get them through. Digestion. Now, speaking of bowel movements, they are also a great indicator on your overall digestion. A lot of people think that just by eating clean or diversifying your diet optimizes your gut health, but actually that's false, because your body isn't efficient. If your body isn't efficiently breaking down and absorbing the nutrients, then it really doesn't matter what you eat, because your body simply doesn't benefit from it. Most people don't know that digestion process actually begins before you start eating. When you smell your food, your mouth begins salivating, and that saliva has enzymes that help you break down your food more efficiently, which is why like I started to take a minute before I start eating to just smell my food and take a couple deep breaths to activate the parasympathetic system. Also, another major thing that most people do is drink lots of water while eating. This can heavily dilute the pH levels of your stomach acid and make it harder for you to digest, make it harder for your stomach to actually break down the food and turn it into chyme. Another thing is make sure you're eating good amounts of fat with every meal. This can be from things like nuts, avocados, fatty meat. Fat is highly crucial for digestion because it helps your liver produce bile, which helps in absorbing fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. But it also helps suppress pathogens and bad bacteria. And what's so fascinating about bile is that certain microbes will use bile to create secondary bile acids, which then help regulate inflammation and signal to immune cells. A good way to tell if you're bile deficient is if your poop or your bowel movements are very pale or very light brown. The darker bowel movements are often a sign of adequate bile production, meaning your body is doing a sufficient job absorbing these vitamins. Gut barrier. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, you're about to learn what 90% of people who talk about gut health don't understand, which is the gut lining. This is a thing that separates your gut from the rest of your body. Now, what makes this so important is that your gut lining is only one cell away from your bloodstream, which means that if you don't have a strong gut lining, toxins, microbial metabolites, endotoxins will all slip through this lining and very quickly end up in your bloodstream. Now, when this happens, your immune system activates and releases pro-inflammatory proteins known as interleukin 6 or interleukin 8, and this is what often triggers inflammation. This is a classic example of leaky gut, which again, like I mentioned, is downstream from a lot of chronic inflammatory and metabolic illnesses. They actually studied the gut barrier in people who had conditions like IBS, IBD, fatty liver, diabetes, kidney disease, and the one thing they had in common was that they had an extremely fragile gut barrier. So how exactly do you strengthen this barrier? Well, one study found that your gut lining is largely protected by tight junction proteins that are influenced by your gut microbiota, which can be impaired with high amounts of oxidative stress. Now, this stress can be physically or mentally induced. So like mental examples could include depression, acute anxiety, or just a very stressful lifestyle. Physical stressors could include poor sleep, dysregulated eating habits, alcohol, drinking too much microplastics and heavy metals, things of that nature. Now, all of these play a critical role in predicting how strong your gut permeability will be. Another study found that increasing levels of butyrate, were shown to significantly decrease permeability of the gut lining. And they did this by injecting exogenous butyrate in the intestinal cells. Now, the good news is that your gut microbiome will already produce sufficient levels of butyrate, which is essentially a short-chain fatty acid, if your diet is rich and diverse. But a key nutrient you should look out for is fermentable fiber. This is especially important for your gut lining because it feeds the butyrate producing bacteria, and it also helps increase mucus production in your gut barrier. Several studies show that fiber deficiency lowered butyrate production in individuals, and this erodes the mucus layer that protects your gut integrity of your barrier. You need to start butyrate maxing for optimal gut lining support, and you can find great sources of fermentable fiber in foods like chia seeds, stewed apples, sweet potatoes, carrots, lentils, and berries. Also, a note for your potatoes or sweet potatoes: you always want to allow them to cool for a couple hours, preferably overnight, before reheating them and eating them, because when you cool them, the structure of the starch actually changes, allowing it to physically resist digestive enzymes and actually pass through your small intestine and then reach your colon, where these microbes can feast off of it, thereby producing butyrate. Immune signaling. Now that we've talked about your gut lining, the final piece of the puzzle is understanding immune signaling and how your gut microbiome actually influences your immune system. By now, you guys are all deeply afraid of inflammation. But the truth is, inflammation is actually very necessary. When you have a fever, for example, your immune cells release pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 or IL-8, and these signal to your brain that a pathogen or a virus is causing chaos and is disrupting your gut. So your brain decides to rapidly heat up your body to help kill these pathogens. Fevers are an immune response to inflammation. And this is what most people get wrong about fevers, by the way, is that the first thing they do when their body temperature starts to rise and they begin feeling the symptoms is they start to take antibiotics or painkillers. And this completely destroys your gut microbiome and thereby weakening your gut lining. So in the short term, you feel better, but with the caveat that you've just destroyed your entire gut. The best thing you can do in a high fever state is to hydrate extensively. Do some breath work. If you watched my last video, you know that specific types of breathing patterns release anti-inflammatory protein signals, and also eat easily digestible and nutrient-dense foods. A lot of people don't eat as much during a fever because they lose their appetite, but that's actually one of the worst things you can do because your body is burning extremely hot and needs quick supporting nutrients to help heal. Focus on bone broths, herbal teas, sweet potatoes. Again, sweet potatoes really are a superfood. Rice and eggs. Fevers are a great example of acute inflammation, but this is where things get a little bit more difficult. When your body is chronically inflamed, meaning your immune system is always active, this also deeply compromises your gut microbiome and gut lining, causing internal oxidative stress. You have to remember that around 70% of your immune cells live within your gut. And depending on the richness of your microbiome, your microbial cells are actually training your immune cells what to react to. If you have a weak gut barrier, your immune cells will release these inflammatory cytokines over specific foods like dairy or nuts, or even in certain environments like in grass, triggering an inflammatory response, which is what is then medically diagnosed as allergies or intolerances. They actually studied this in 2012. They looked at mice with very few microbes or very poor microbiome diversity, and they saw that they had very high internal stress and symptoms of low-grade inflammation. They then colonized their microbiome with human microbiota, and many of these mice's immune functions began restoring. Certain immune cells also began maturing, meaning they wouldn't be as responsive to low-grade sources. They then retested this exact study this year in 2025 with mice that had even more disrupted immune signaling, and by repopulating their microbiome with human microbiota, these mice began developing adaptive and innate immune responses. The whole conclusion here is that your microbiome directly contributes and directly influence not just the strength of your immune system, but what and how they react to it. So key things to optimize your immune tolerance and efficiency. Sleep. Poor sleep has been clinically studied for decades, and it's one of the most impactful on your health. But it's also been shown to increase inflammatory cytokines and decrease the strength of your immune cells by up to 400% in one night alone. Exercise, also been studied for decades, and amongst the many benefits like cardiovascular health, increase in hemoglobin, improvements in metabolism, there's also one major benefit in improving immune efficiency and lowering chronic inflammation. Optimizing your microbiome. We've already talked about this, just wanted to put this here again to emphasize how important it is. Now, the fourth one, amino acids. This is actually very crucial for supporting immune cells, antibodies, and cytokine release. I've also noticed that people who eat raw meat or like a very hyper ancestral diet often have far better immune systems than most people. Now, I haven't really looked into the studies on this, but it's definitely not BS and might actually be very beneficial for supporting immune function. Now, you don't need to eat raw meat to get amino acids. You can get them from cooked animal-based products like beef, steak, eggs, milk, yogurt, and kefir. That's it. This is literally everything you need to know on optimizing for peak gut health. If you learned something useful from this video, you can check out some of my other videos. I talk about esoteric and weird health practices. And if you don't agree with anything I said, please drop a comment.